Some were taken from angles that suggested they were shot through vents or hidden cameras. My stomach churned. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. That's when I noticed the mannequins. They were scattered around the room, dressed in tattered clothing, their faces painted with grotesque smiles. When I asked him about the scream, he just looked at me and said, "You must have been dreaming," but I knew I wasn't. The next few nights were even worse. The footsteps grew louder, the whispers more insistent. I didn't believe in horror stories, not really, until it happened to me. A year ago, I was down on my luck. I'd just broken up with my girlfriend, lost my job, and my apartment lease was ending. I had no choice but to scramble and find a new place to live. My savings were running thin, so I turned to those online roommate apps where strangers list rooms for rent. Desperation does things to you. It makes you ignore your instincts, lower your standards, and take risks you wouldn't otherwise take. That's how I ended up in the nightmare that changed my life. I came across a listing for a room in a 2-bedroom house located in a quiet suburban area on the outskirts of Toronto. The rent was surprisingly cheap, $900 a month, utilities included. The ad was listed by a guy named Graham. He described himself as a quiet, easygoing guy who valued his privacy, but was looking for someone to share his house with to cut down on expenses. It sounded perfect for me. No crazy parties, no loud roommates, just peace and quiet. I scheduled a viewing for the next day. When I arrived at the house, the first thing that struck me was how dark the windows were, like the curtains had never been opened. The lawn was unkempt, and the mailbox was stuffed with unopened letters. I chalked it up to Graham being the kind of guy who wasn't big on upkeep. I knocked on the door, and after a long, uncomfortable pause, he opened it. Graham was in his late 30s, a bit older than me. His appearance was unkempt. His greasy hair hung over his eyes, and his clothes were wrinkled and stained. But what really struck me was his eyes. They were dark, sunken, and devoid of life. When he spoke, his voice was low and soft, almost like he was whispering. I tried to push past the uneasiness gnawing at me. I was desperate for a place, and this seemed like my best option. He showed me around the house. It was dingy, with a musty smell that seemed to cling to everything. The living room was cluttered with old furniture, and there were stacks of dusty newspapers piled against the walls. As we walked down the narrow hallway, Graham pointed out the bedroom I'd be renting. It was basic but clean enough. A bed, a dresser, and a small window that let in a sliver of light. "There are just a few rules," Graham said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No visitors, no loud music, and absolutely no going into the basement." The basement. Something about the way he emphasized that word sent a chill down my spine, but I shrugged it off. Maybe he just had a hoarding problem down there or something. Against my better judgment, I agreed to rent the room. We didn't sign a lease. It was all off the books. I gave him the first month's rent in cash, and by the next morning, I'd moved in. I thought I could live with Graham's strange rules as long as I had a roof over my head. But from the very first night, things felt wrong. The house had a way of amplifying sounds. Every creak, every groan of the old floorboards echoed through the empty halls, making it impossible to tell where the noises were coming from. My first night there, I was lying in bed, trying to drift off to sleep, when I heard what sounded like footsteps pacing back and forth just outside my door. At first, I thought it was just Graham, maybe having trouble sleeping, but the footsteps didn't stop. They went on for hours, an incessant, restless shuffle. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, too scared to move. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the house was settling, that it was just old pipes or rodents in the walls. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I confronted Graham about the noise. His response was strange. He just stared at me for a long moment, his eyes unblinking, before saying in that low, whispery voice, "Sometimes the house makes noises. Best not to worry about it." Then he turned and walked away without another word. I tried to shake off the weird vibes. I needed a place to stay, and I couldn't afford to be picky. But as the days went on, things only got stranger. Every night, like clockwork, I would hear those footsteps. Sometimes they'd be slow and deliberate, other times quick and frantic, like someone running in circles. And then there were the whispers. At first, I thought they were coming from Graham's room, but they seemed to seep through the walls, a hushed, urgent murmur that sent chills down my spine. One night, unable to take it anymore, I got up and opened my door, hoping to catch Graham in the act. But the hallway was empty, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the house. The footsteps stopped the moment I stepped into the hall, as if whoever, or whatever, was making them had sensed me. One evening, I came home from work and found the basement door slightly ajar. I remembered Graham's rule about never going down there, but curiosity got the better of me. I nudged the door open with my foot and peered into the darkness below. There were no lights on, just the faint smell of damp earth and something else. Something rotten. I reached for the light switch, but it didn't work. The basement was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow the light from my phone's flashlight. I took a few hesitant steps down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell got worse, a pungent mix of mold and decay. Halfway down the stairs, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, raspy breath coming from somewhere in the darkness. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped, replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I bolted back up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, convinced that something had been down there with me. But when I looked around, the house was empty. Graham was nowhere to be seen. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and more frantic than ever. I could hear them circling my bed, stopping just outside my door, then retreating down the hall. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in that house. The whispers, the footsteps, the cold spots that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was like the entire place was alive and watching me. But whenever I tried to confront Graham about it, he would just brush me off with that dead-eyed stare. I decided to test the waters one more time. "Hey, Graham," I said one evening while he was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of cold coffee. "Is there something wrong with the basement? I thought I heard something weird down there the other night." Graham's head snapped up so fast that I flinched. For a moment, his expression was wild, almost terrified. But just as quickly, he composed himself, the blank mask slipping back into place. "Like I said before," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, "you don't go down there. Ever." There was something in his eyes, a glimmer of fear that he was desperately trying to hide. I pressed him further, asking why, but he simply stood up, took his cup, and walked away without another word. The conversation was over. That night I was lying in bed trying to make sense of it all when I heard it again. The footsteps. Only this time they were different. They didn't stop outside my door. Instead, they kept going, moving down the hall towards Graham's room. And then I heard him scream. It was a blood-curdling scream, the kind that comes from deep, primal terror. I shot out of bed and ran to his door, banging on it frantically. "Graham, are you okay?" I shouted, but there was no response, only the muffled sound of something heavy being dragged. I tried the door, but it was locked. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I debated whether to call the police, but just as I reached for my phone, the noise stopped. The house fell into an unnatural silence, like the air had been sucked out of the room. The next morning, Graham acted like nothing had happened. He was sitting at the kitchen table again, sipping his coffee with that same vacant stare. When I asked him about the scream, he just looked at me and said, "You must have been dreaming." But I knew I wasn't. The next few nights were even worse. The footsteps grew louder, the whispers more insistent. And then there were the shadows. I started seeing them out of the corner of my eye. Dark, hunched figures that seemed to move just beyond the edge of the light. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. One evening, I came home to find Graham gone. There was a note on the fridge. Out for a few days, don't go in the basement. The temptation was too great. With Graham out of the house, I decided to take my chance. I had to know what was down there, what he was hiding. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the basement door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob. The stench hit me like a wall as soon as I opened the door. It was worse than before, a sickening mix of decay and something metallic. I covered my nose and stepped inside. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the suffocating silence. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing old, moldy furniture and broken boxes. But as I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. The basement was much larger than I had realized. The walls were covered in strange, faded symbols, like a language I couldn't understand. And then, at the far end of the room, I saw it. A door I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. It was padlocked, but the lock was rusted and brittle. With enough force, I managed to break it open. As I pushed the door open, a gust of cold, damp air hit me, sending shivers down my spine. The room beyond was pitch black, but I could hear something, a faint, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat. I shone my flashlight around the room, and that's when I saw it. There were photos taped to the walls, hundreds of them. Some were old and yellowed, others more recent, but they all had one thing in common. They were all of me. Pictures of me in my room, me in the kitchen, me sleeping. Some were taken from angles that suggested they were shot through vents or hidden cameras. My stomach churned. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. That's when I noticed the mannequins. They were scattered around the room, dressed in tattered clothing, their faces painted with grotesque smiles. Each one had something strapped to its chest, small, blackened dolls with pins sticking out of their eyes. But the worst part? There was one mannequin that looked exactly like Graham. It was positioned in the corner, facing the wall, its hands clasped in prayer. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, a low, guttural growl. I spun around, but the room was empty. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging me into darkness. I screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and I could feel something moving in the darkness, circling me. And then I heard it. That same whisper, only this time it was right in my ear. You shouldn't have come here. When Graham returned the next day, I was waiting for him in the kitchen, trembling and pale. I confronted him about the room, the photos, the mannequins, but he just stared at me with that dead-eyed gaze. Leave, he said, his voice a flat monotone. Leave before it takes you. What takes me? What the hell are you talking about? I demanded, but he just shook his head and turned away. That night, I packed my bags, determined to get out of that house. But as I was leaving, I heard it again, that low, raspy breathing. It was coming from the walls, the floors, even the ceiling. The house itself seemed to be alive, like it was trying to keep me there. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The windows were sealed shut. Panic set in as the shadows around me began to shift and move, forming dark, twisted shapes that seemed to reach out for me. I could hear the whispers again, growing louder and more insistent. You can't leave. And then out of the darkness, I saw him. Graham, or whatever was left of him. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes black and hollow. He moved towards me with unnatural speed, his mouth opening into a twisted grin. You should have listened, he rasped. Now you belong to the house. I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was surrounded by shadows, and the next I was stumbling onto the street, gasping for air. I never went back for my belongings. I just ran. I moved into a cramped apartment downtown, far away from that cursed house. But the nightmares haven't stopped. I still hear the whispers, see the shadows moving in the corners of my vision. Sometimes, late at night, I can hear footsteps pacing outside my door. I tried to report what happened, but the police didn't believe me. They said Graham was never there. According to them, the house has been abandoned for years. But I know the truth. The house is still there, waiting, watching, and sometimes, late at night, I can hear it calling my name.